At a recent congressional hearing, Lois Lerner from the IRS said this.
My counsel has advised me that I have not waived my constitutional rights under the Fifth Amendment, and on his advice, I will decline to answer any question on the subject matter of this hearing.
The IRS has become a politically corrupt organization, used as a weapon by the deep state and sitting presidents as a weapon against their opponents. Nobody tried harder than Ronald Reagan to fix the tax system.
Over the course of this century, our tax system has been modified dozens of times and in hundreds of ways. Yet most of those changes didn't improve the system. They made it more like Washington itself, complicated, unfair, cluttered with gobbledygook and loopholes designed for those with the power and influence to hire high-priced legal and tax advisors.
It's no secret that lobbyists are bribing politicians with campaign donations. Most of the lobbying involves tax deductions for special interests. These lobbyists expect a return on investment. The tax breaks they are receiving are far greater than the bribes to Congress. The ultra-rich are virtually exempt from taxes. This is why the top 1% own and control everything.
If we had zero corporate tax in this country, I believe tens of millions of jobs would get created. If we did not have corporate tax, if we did not have income tax, I believe that pink slips would get issued to 80% of Washington lobbyists, because that's why they're there, to garner special tax favor.
The 74,000-page tax code is testament to just how corrupt the income tax has become. Lord Acton said this, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Some examples of power corrupting. If a creepy old guy can get beautiful young girls to sleep with him just because they could potentially make them a movie star, what could a creepy old woman get from special interests for tax deductions?
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
You can see that politicians don't read the bills before voting. They vote as the lobbyists demand that they vote. Elections have become pre-auctions on stolen goods. They say they are taxing the rich, but who they are actually taxing is small business. They are confiscating working capital from small business, while the ultra-rich pay nothing. This is why the top 1% own and control everything, and the middle class is disappearing. The diversion is that you can't permanently remove the income tax without a constitutional amendment. But is that true? We have 3 branches of government. Congress passes laws and authorizes spending. The Supreme Court interprets laws and determines if laws are constitutional. The executive branch enforces laws as passed by Congress and ruled on by the Supreme Court. How have the courts ruled on the income tax? Let's take a look.
Now here's the truth about what the Supreme Court has ruled and what is the standing settled law of the land regarding the nature of the income tax. In 1916, after the 16th Amendment was adopted 3 years previously, a number of challenges had arisen to the implementation of the income tax when it was revived in 1913, promptly upon the adoption of the 16th Amendment. The tax at that time was 51 years old already, but it had been on hiatus. It had been dormant since 1895, when the Supreme Court had ruled in the case of Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust that as far as the application to 2 different things, dividends and rents, the application of the tax caused it to become a property tax rather than an income tax by an argument of resort to the source from which the income was derived. That is, the personal property in the form of stock and in the form of real estate from which rent and dividends were derived. The court said this actually constitutes, for all practical purposes, a tax on those sources rather than the income itself, rather than the activity that produced the taxable activity that produced the gains, and therefore it's a property tax, and therefore it has to be apportioned as a direct tax. That was the reasoning in the Pollock case. 16th Amendment overturns that, and we'll get to that in a moment. So in 1916, this revival of the income tax was challenged by a man named Frank Brucheber, who was a stockholder in the Union Pacific Railroad Company, a railroad which is a national instrumentality in which the dividends from that stock was naturally an excisable gain. Brucheber argued that the 16th Amendment had the effect of creating a direct non-apportioned tax. That is to say, a tax that functioned as a capitation or other direct tax, and yet wasn't subject to the apportionment rule that applies to all such taxes under the Constitution. The court, in a unanimous decision, disagreed. The Brucheber ruling unambiguously confines the income tax to the objects and administrative rules of an indirect excise tax only. Brucheber holds that the sole purpose and effect of the 16th Amendment is to undo and overrule its conclusion in Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust, which I mentioned a moment ago, that a tax on otherwise excise taxable dividends and rent becomes a property tax in those particular instances. Pollock had reasoned that the linkage of dividends and rent to their personal property sources, the stock or the real estate from which they are derived, transforms the income excise on those gains into a property tax on the sources, which therefore requires apportionment. The 16th Amendment, says the Brucheber court, severs or prohibits the source linkage imagined by the Pollock court. This overruling allowed the by then 51-year-old income tax to be revived and to resume application as the excise tax it has always been. Brucheber very expressly rules that the 16th Amendment does not accomplish its task by creating some kind of hybrid tax, which can have the character of a capitation or other direct tax, and yet not be subject to the apportionment rule, a non-apportioned direct tax. This was, in fact, the exact contention of Frank Brucheber, against whom the court ruled, who reasoned from this faulty notion the confused conclusion that the post-amendment revival of the income tax created a constitutional conflict. Here's what the unanimous Supreme Court says, among a lot of other things in what is really a very long, thoughtful, and comprehensive ruling, well worth reading, even though Justice White, the Chief Justice White, who wrote it, was a man who was fond of 60-word sentences, and so it's a little bit of a slog to get through it, but nonetheless, good material. Here's what they said. Again, a unanimous Supreme Court. We are of the opinion that the confusion is not inherent, but rather arises from the conclusion that the 16th Amendment provides for a hitherto unknown power of taxation. That is, a power to levy an income tax, which, although direct, should not be subject to the regulation of apportionment applicable to all other direct taxes. And the far-reaching effect of this erroneous assumption, you notice that's in bold because this is what the court is saying. This is an erroneous assumption. It does not do this. Will be made clear by generalizing the many contentions advanced in argument to support it. Brucheber had argued 15 different approaches in his effort to try and argue that this tax was unconstitutional. And the reason for that was simple. His dividends from his Union Pacific Railroad stock were being taxed before being distributed, and he wanted to stop that. So this is the nature of his argument. So that's Brucheber versus Union Pacific Railroad, 240 U.S. 1 in 1916. The court goes on to point out that the very idea of a non-apportioned direct tax is incoherent because it would cause one provision of the Constitution to destroy another. That is, it would result in bringing the provisions of the amendment, supposedly exempting a direct tax from apportionment, into irreconcilable conflict with the general requirement that all direct taxes be apportioned. You'll note the 16th Amendment does not repeal the apportionment requirement at all. This result, instead of simplifying the situation and making clear the limitations on the taxing power, which obviously the amendment must have been intended to accomplish, would create radical and destructive changes in our constitutional system and multiply confusion. Again, no ambiguity here. The Supreme Court is being perfectly clear in its language and in what it's saying, and you'll understand my emphasis on that point shortly. The Brucheber Court reiterates its repeated pre-16th Amendment holdings that taxation on income is in its nature an excise, entitled to be enforced as such. Okay, this is pretty clear, right? The unanimous Brucheber Court flatly holds that the income tax was, is, and remains an excise tax, and that the 16th Amendment in no way whatever authorizes a non-apportioned direct tax. Okay? Okay, summarize. The Supreme Court's words in the Brucheber, this is what we've seen. The Supreme Court's words in the Brucheber ruling itself, the 1916 Cornell Law Quarterly, and Harvard Law Quarterly reporting on the Bruchaber decision, the Supreme Court referencing and reiterating the Bruchaber ruling in 1916, 1937, and 1988, the Treasury Department's tax legislative draftsman in 1943, and the Library of Congress's legislative attorney in 1979 discussing the Bruchaber ruling. All agree that Bruchaber rules the income tax to always have been and to still remain an indirect excise tax, that the 16th Amendment does not authorize any kind of non-apportioned direct tax, and that non-apportioned direct taxes remain constitutionally prohibited. Was that clear to everyone as we proceeded? Okay. The Bruchaber ruling is the thoroughly settled law of the land. Every institution of government knows that and knows what Bruchaber says. Here's the bottom line. The receipts subject to the federal excise, the income in the federal income tax, are those produced through the exercise of certain federal privileges and no others. Just like the name says, it is a federal income tax. It's not a federal income tax like federal tax on all income, federal tax on everything that comes in. It's a tax on federal income, period. If it's not federally connected, it's not income. It's not subject to the tax.
The Supreme Court has ruled, declaring the federal income tax an excise tax. President Trump has a duty to treat the federal income tax as an excise tax. Libertarians would say replace the income tax with nothing, and others would say replace it with the fair tax.
It would be a 28% consumption tax
across the board
on all new goods and services, not used goods and services. And before you fall off the chair, the theory is that it wouldn't necessarily, it would be cost neutral. So if I could use a can of Coke as an example, a can of Coke that sells for $1 today has corporate tax contained in that buck. It has unemployment contained in that buck. It has Social Security match contained in that buck. It has Medicare contained in that dollar. It has the accounting fees and the legal fees that go along with complying with the IRS and the filing with IRS. So arguably, the can of Coke would not sell for $1. It would sell for 73 cents. And then the 28% tax would get applied to the can of Coke. So you'd still end up paying $1 for the can of Coke. That's the theory.
Sticking with the 28% sales tax, imported goods would have the same rate of taxation as domestic products, giving domestic manufacturers a more level playing field. Exports would leave the country tax-free. The United States would become a much more desirable place for manufacturers. The United States would become a competitive powerhouse. It would take a constitutional amendment to install the fair tax. The swamp dwellers would never agree to getting rid of the income tax voluntarily. Facing the loss of the income tax, the swamp dwellers may support the fair tax.
If we had zero corporate tax in this country, I believe tens of millions of jobs would get created. If we did not have corporate tax, if we did not have income tax, I believe that pink slips would get issued to 80% of Washington lobbyists, because that's why they're there, to garner special tax favor.